everyone. Thank you very much for being here, and I'd especially like to welcome Hamish Carmichael, who's come down from Scotland. The awful weather we're having down here, and he's come all the way down. So the talk today is going to be a history of information retrieval, and I'm very pleased to be introducing Keith van Rijsbergen. For the last 40 years or more, his research has been devoted to information retrieval, covering both theoretical and experimental aspects, and he's the author of the well-known book on information retrieval. He's going to present an account of the history of information retrieval from the beginning of the 20th century to now, and he's going to be discussing research, development and exploitation in Britain, including how the now almost standard experimental methodology for evaluation and measurement of performance of IR systems arose in Britain, and he'll be acknowledging early researchers in the field. Keith, over to you.
Thank you. I just had a sense of relief when I realised that the abstract is quite close to what I've prepared. Because you know what it's like, you write the abstract many weeks beforehand and then you sort of forget about it, you see. And sometimes you're lucky and sometimes you're not lucky. And I think I'm lucky. Right, well, that's me. And you can see I've interpolated a little, I don't need to see, a little brief in there because I realised that as I was preparing it, as I was going along, that the amount of material that I was going through was so vast that I thought, no, this is getting out of hand. So I spent most of my time the last couple of weeks just trying to decide which bits I was going to talk about, and so it's basically going to be sort of a brief history. Now, thank you for inviting me, all right? And it's a pleasure to be here, especially since a lot of people who, like me, have retired, are in this audience, and I haven't seen them for months. It's a real pleasure to bump into them, actually. So that's an extra pleasure for being here. Now, the other thing, which is a little unusual for when I give talks, it's partly because the talk is mostly in words, right? There's the occasional symbol. I usually give talks which are full of symbols with the occasional words. I usually say, well, delay questions until I get to the end, because if I lose the thread on the symbols, then, well, basically I get lost. Well, I think I'd like to reverse that. If you want me to expand on some point about what I'm talking about, please don't hesitate and sort of stick a hand up or even just interject. I'll be delighted to just make a little detour, because I think this is, it's not exactly a dialogue, but there are a number of people here who probably not necessarily about the entirety of IR, information retrieval, know about as much about some aspects that I do. So I'd be delighted if people would produce some input. Is there a little light on these lecterns? No, there isn't, is there? There is. Could you turn it on for me? That's it, brilliant, because occasionally I need to look at these notes. Right, so I'll start with a few caveats. So it's going to be incomplete, and simply because there is too much. I really can't do justice to the field. Now, in a sense, this is a bit strange. I think it's an indication that still a lot of abstraction needs to be done in certain parts of the field, which hasn't been done. So what you know is just a lot of detail without necessarily knowing the abstraction. So I've tried to concentrate on the things that I know most about, obviously, and there are some things which I've deliberately avoided talking about, and that'll become clear as I go along why it is. So, for example, I've avoided talking about user studies. Now, this is not because I think user studies, or HGI as it's often called, are not important. They are. In fact, I've supervised several PhDs in the subject, but it really is too much to try and cover that at the same time. So I can certainly say some things about it if somebody wants me to. It's UK biased, and I'm concentrating on the developments in the UK. Now, obviously, there were developments in Europe, the rest of Europe, and there were very significant developments in the United States, obviously. But what's interesting from my point of view is the development in the UK, because in many cases the earlier work, the significant earlier work, was done in the UK. So that's why I think I would want to concentrate on. I'm also going to emphasize what the developments from the computer science point of view. Now, you'll see there that I say computer science and IS. Well, IS stands for information science. Now, information science is the sort of grand title for librarians, library studies, librarianship. This is not to degrade it, but people prefer to talk about information science as all-encompassing. Now again, I try to not get sidetracked into that. I will try and stick to the work that was motivated from a computer science point of view. I'm going to talk about automatic retrieval rather than manual. Manual retrieval, was a thriving business until probably about the 60s, 50s and 60s. It doesn't matter whether it was retrieval in libraries or it was retrieval in some other context, but it clearly was important. Now, on the other hand, most retrieval, when you're talking about retrieval from either text or from other kinds of objects like images or video clips, is going to be automatic and done by proper computers. Right? And so that's again going to be an emphasis I'm going to have, and I'm going to again emphasize text rather than other media. It would be just as easy to give some talks about the retrieval from other media. I mean, the underlying theory and the underlying models and the underlying technology isn't all that different, but it's convenient to stick to text. So, to begin with, I shall go back, and this I've only become aware of this in the last couple of years actually. I'll go back to what I think is probably one of the earliest developments in what I think of as automatic information retrieval, some kind or another. And this goes back to the work of a man called Emanuel Goldberg. Now, Emanuel Goldberg was a scientist who worked at Zeiss in Germany around about the 20s, 30s. And he only became, well, no, not quite actually. There was one or two people who knew about him in the 60s, and I've tracked that down, but it's not entirely clear what they knew about his work. But anyway, his work became known in the last few years when Michael Buckland, who was a professor at Berkeley, wrote a book about him. And I recommend the book about Emanuel Goldberg because it's not only about the development of technology in Zeiss, which is mostly optical technology to do with retrieving, say, in the case of retrieval, sorry, it's to do with retrieving from microfilm, but there's all sorts of other things that the man developed. And he was really seen as a very, very, very excellent pioneer of certain types of technology. And he was caught up in the anti-Jewish stuff of the 1930s, and he was basically hounded out of Germany. He then spent some time in the States, and he then ended up in Israel. The early part of his career was somewhat unfortunate, partly because of what happened during the Nazi regime. But nevertheless, he developed what I think is probably one of the most interesting retrieval systems, the technology for such a system based on optics, on microfilm. Then I will talk a little bit about Bush, who is typically, excuse me, is there somebody still? No, that's all right. I thought maybe I should move over a bit. The Bush is typically cited as sort of the beginner, the sort of the leading light, what started the idea of information retrieval and so on. And I would argue with that, and in fact I'm not the only one to argue with that, although what he did was quite interesting. And he wrote a very, very influential article, but people had quite a lot of sort of, criticism of it. And then lastly, the person I would talk about, this is sort of the early history, is a man called Robert Fairthorne. Now, I'm a great admirer of Fairthorne. He did some absolutely phenomenal work in the 60s and the 50s. I mean, not that he did phenomenal work in building things, but his theory, his thoughts, right, that he had and then published were quite extraordinary. Even to this day, when I reread some of his articles, they still seem relevant to the research that's going on now. So I think this is one of the heroes, and he's, as I say, he's from the UK. So, what Goldberg, how's that? Is that coming up reasonably well? Because I had some trouble deciding what was going to display or not. Yeah. He developed a machine, and I'll show you in a minute, just for fun, that there's actually a patent for the machine, called the statistical machine. And basically, it was based on a microfilm going past an optical device. And what you could do is you could put in front of the light, you could put a card with a binary coding on it, which would then shine, the light would shine through and hit the microfilm, and then depending on whether there was a match, right, it would either trigger in the focus cell that's right on the right, it would either trigger it or not. Now the point is, this was part of a bigger system, and I'll explain in a minute what the bigger system is. So that's the guts of it. That there's a microfilm that's going at a reasonably high speed, there's a light, and there's a way of putting a card with holes, a binary coding in front of the light, and you can actually detect a match. And when you detect the match, right, it basically stops and displays the image, which is what the next slide sort of shows. Okay? So you have the bottom half of the slide is the detection mechanism, right, and the top half of the slide basically shows the display of the stuff. Now this was done in the 20s, 30s, around about then. I'll check that in a minute. And so he had actually built what we now think of as a kind of a workstation, right? He used it in practice. So he would have on his desk this device, and it was usually microfilm that had in it encoded sort of correspondence or some office material anyway. And so when he had somebody come to talk to him about some aspect of their business, he would retrieve using this thing, and the thing itself was sitting on his desk, and it would then display an image of, say, the correspondence on a screen or a wall somewhere in the room. So it was basically a workbench for him, or a workstation. And Goldberg developed this, right? And he developed this, it came out of his extreme expertise in optics during the time that he was working for Zeiss in Germany. And just don't try and read the stuff at the bottom. This is the actual patent that was lodged. He lodged the patent in Germany, and he lodged one in the United States. And the German one, I think, was in the late 20s, and then after that you got the American one. So let's just say approximately around 1930 was a patent. Now, moving on to Bush a little bit. Bush actually also experimented with this kind of stuff, and he came up with the actual device called MEMIX, which was a paper device, right? It was not an actual working device. And apparently the story is that when Bush was working on this stuff, Vannevar Bush, right, he claimed that he didn't really know about this work of Goldberg, which is a bit surprising actually. This is the paper device that Bush designed. Now I was going to actually show you a sort of a simulation of this, but I was told I couldn't rely on internet connection, so I thought I'd better not. But if you type MEMIX in Google or Bing or some other device, you'll get a site which has an animation of this device at Sheffield. Sheffield have done an animation of it, so they talk you through how it works. But basically, it's similar to what Goldberg had, but it's all encapsulated in sort of slightly more modern setup. So the machinery is under the desktop, and there are various display devices on top. Now, MEMIX is a device which tried to advance an idea about using a storage device as a kind of an extension of your personal memory. So it wasn't really to do what you might call full large-scale retrieval. It built associative networks, which were, if you like, an augmentation of your own brain. and it was meant to help you with that. And if you look at the animation, you'll see that that's how it's worked out. And Bush, Vannevar Bush, I mean, I'm sure many of you you've heard of him because he was one of the very sort of important engineers during the war and after the war in the United States. Anyway, he wrote this article and was published in 1945, and on all accounts it was extremely influential. But as time went on, although people still cited it, I don't think a lot of people understood that that device was never actually built. It was really a paper device. And so, as a motivating force, it remained. And because people didn't know about any other work, they basically tended to cite Bush and his work on mimics as the beginning of the field. So the chap who sort of wrote this book about Goldberg, Buckland, was fairly scathing about Bush actually, or his work. So his name is Michael Buckland, and in 1992 he suggested that Bush's work wasn't really, from the point of view of information retrieval, wasn't really what was wanted. Basically making the point, and this point keeps being made over and over again on the subject, that what's important is actually the indexing process, and it's very difficult to get around that point of view. In other words, you do need the indexing of one kind or another, and this is the point that Buckland makes. So if you see at the bottom of the slide there, I'm sure you can take this in, I'm assuming it's readable, yes. Then if you wanted to pursue that, please do read the book. I think it's a very, very nice account of what went on before the war, and if you like, the story of Goldberg himself. He did a lot of other things too, and he lodged many, many patents. Right, so let's go back to Fairthorne again. And I've linked occasionally things to the British Computer Society. So, in the very first issue of the of the Computer Journal, right, was a paper by Robert Fairthorne. Right, it was actually on page 36. I'd hoped that it might have been on page 1, but it wasn't. It would have been rather nice. But he wrote a paper called Automatic Retrieval of Recorded Information, and in fact, in that he makes, I think, a very compelling case that the mechanization of retrieval, as we knew it then, right, which is 1958, which is mostly based on manual techniques, that the mechanization could indeed be done with the help of computers. Right, it's a very strong case, and it's well written, and it's a lovely article, actually. And again, like Michael Buckland, he was fairly critical of the mimics ideas on the sort of grounds that I've been saying. Now, there are a number of pioneers, what I would call pioneers in the subject, and for me, the greatest pioneer of all in the subject, although a lot of people would disagree with that, but this is a personal view, is a man called M.E. Marin, Bill Marin. He worked in the States, he worked in Rand Corporation, and I'm just quoting a phrase of his: the problems of mechanical documentation do not relate primarily to hardware, they are intellectual problems. Now, I mean, I spend a little bit of time talking about the sort of hardware developments that you might have seen in the early days, but this has been a concern of people working in information retrieval, is to constantly say, no, it's not. We're not trying to solve a hardware problem here, right? We'll just use regular computers. What we're trying to do is solve some intellectual problems to do with information retrieval. That is, intellectual problems about how you might represent text, how you might match a piece of text with a query, and so on. This kind of stuff, right? There are lots of underlying intellectual problems, and Marin was one of the first to actually emphasize that, and that's why I've quoted him. But there were obviously developments in hardware, and I just want to say to show you a couple. One of them is for fun, which I found. Oh, wait a minute, I have to finish this little story about Fairthorne. So Fairthorne actually wrote a book called, well, he didn't write it, sorry, he produced a book called Towards Information Retrieval, which was published in 1961 The date is sort of critical. I keep producing a few dates because things happened around about that time, and it's important to recognize that what the dates actually are. But he had in it chapters, and that basically they're reproductions of articles that he had already written. So one was on the mathematics of classification, and then automata and information, very modern sounding thing, patterns of retrieval, and then classification of self-organizing systems. So he was already thinking about these things before the 1960s. And if you read those things, you realize that the man was really intellectually ahead of people by a long, long, long way. Anyway, I'll come back to Fairthorne a little bit later on. Just to say, because I might forget to mention, for example, the one on the mathematics of classification, which is of course one of the things which was of interest to me because of my personal research interest. He actually proposed the use of non-Boolean logic, right, Browerian logic. And for me to discover that, a few years ago, well, probably I discovered it about 10 years ago, I thought, blimey, here am I thinking about all this stuff, and this guy was there doing it already 40 years earlier. Why didn't I know? Anyway, we all know now. So there's an interesting hardware device. Talking a little bit about hardware, I found this in the catalogue. So this is probably the earliest bit of hardware that's sort of very tangible, right? Apart from this optical stuff. This is a catalogue which I have in my possession, and it was a catalogue that was produced in 1924, and it was a catalogue for devices to do mostly with office automation, actually. And you probably don't realise, but in the 70s, I think it was, quite a lot of information retrieval work was actually oriented towards office automation. But here in 1924, somebody had a finding and filing device. Now, I didn't get time to really, in detail, figure out how this device worked, but it was cards which were marked, like a peekaboo system, but except that it was done mechanically. So it was basically a sorting device. But they called it a finding and filing device. This is one of the earliest devices I could find in the hardware. This is the one I was worried about to begin with. Right. This is the first hardware development in IR that I've been able to track down that uses computers. Yeah, there was a man called Bagley who was at MIT, and he did a master's thesis, and he actually designed electronic machine, if you like, or electronic devices to do high-speed retrieval. And usually people don't go back as far as this to actually find. So the object of this thesis is to what's it say? You can read it. Oh, excellent. Right. Okay. Then you move on to the 1980s, and obviously there are lots and lots of mechanical, electronic machines that were devised to help in retrieval. The one that I found, and I think it was sort of mid-80s or maybe a little earlier, the one that I found in most interesting was the development inside a company called Thinking Machines, which again was in the States, and it was it grew out of the work of a man called Danny Hillis, who became quite well known in the States, and he designed a series of machines called connection machines, and so there was CM1, 2, 3, 4, up to 5 or something like that, and then the company went out of business. But they also had attached to these machines a data vault. Now the machines themselves were, I think initially they might have had MIMD architecture, but they kind of migrated towards SIMD architectures. But they connected to it a data vault, which was a RAID device. This is in the mid-80s, and I was in discussion with them about doing IR actually, and one of the things they couldn't get was actually the high enough speed between the data vault and the machine. Right, that's what let them down, apparently. So they said. So that was a serious bit of hardware development. There were people who worked on associative memories. Right, so in the UK you had a man called Lee. I think his name was Mike Lee, And then Simon Lavington, and I'm never quite sure to what extent that was a pure hardware development, but certainly it was influenced by hardware development quite considerably, which was to develop a triple store, as Simon would call it. That was also. And then finally, the content addressable file stores, CAFs, they were developed by ICL. And for many years they tried to push CAFs on people as a kind of a retrieval device and so on. Now I don't know, I have no idea what happened to CAFs, but it certainly it's lost in history. They still exist, do they?
You had one of its support and one of its great experts in the room.
Well, he can tell us what's happened to it. Maybe it still exists, I don't know. That'll be good. There was a man called Ed Babb, who he did a PhD in Cambridge, the same time as me, and he migrated to ICL to work on CAFs. And I talked to him for quite a while, but it seemed to fade away. I'm not quite sure, because I always thought it was quite a sexy device, actually.
May I say something about it?
Yes,
Standard
please.
Feature,
Sorry?
Standard feature on all ICL disk controllers into the early 2000s.
And what happened to them in the end?
Still in use. Still in use in certain areas.
Is it? What are they attaching to? To any general purpose computer? Right.
It's a disk controller that contains hardware. Coupled with any machine that can send the appropriate commands down to it.
And is it still, I mean, at the beginning I think it was the logic was on the head, or it's not like that? No. Right. Okay.
It involved parallel reading, all the cells of this price simultaneously.
Right.
Paralleling data stream and process that.
Right. So they've just sort of gone into the skirting board, so to speak. Is that it?
The power of modern computers makes something irrelevant.
Right. Okay.
It wasn't that time. It was asking at that time.
Yeah, I know that. That's why I was interested in it. Yeah.
But still capable. Well, I had a PhD student at Butterworths doing some work on specific retrieval. And we ran some tests on a Sparck machine.
Yeah.
And against the current version of the ICL CAS system. The ICL CAS system beat it by a factor of by an order of magnitude.
Right. Okay.
That was about 1990.
1990. Right. Okay. Well, there you go. There's life in the old device yet. Right. It's like us, you know. Anyway, thank you for that, because I did wonder about that. Now, a little bit more parochial, because there are parochial bits in this talk, and I deliberately wanted to make it parochial because the people I'm going to talk about, many of you would have known. Right. And the first person I want to say a few things about is Roger Needham. Now I'm sorry about this, but I scanned this in and my eyesight is so poor I couldn't decide whether this would scan up or not. But basically what's important here, oh yes, it's not bad actually. Yeah, no, I sort of sat and looked at it and thought, well, is it my eyesight or is it, yeah, it is my eyesight, so it's alright. So this is a report that was asked for by Donald Mickey. Now, maybe somebody in the audience know what this report really was. So this was, if you like, in 1964, it was Roger writing to, you'll see in a minute why this was important in the context of Roger, writing to Donald Mickey. And there's a report to the SRC. Right, so I have the, which is, there's a sort of a little side story. When Sparck Jones, just before Sparck Jones died, she gave me a whole pile of documents, right, including a copy of this, she really thought was important. And she gave me a copy of Roger's PhD thesis, which I'll come to in a minute. But Roger actually gave a fairly good, and I'll come back to what he said in a minute in more detail, a fairly good comparison between databases and information retrieval systems. So he sort of summarized it there, verbally, right? And then at the end, and that's what my next slide is about, he goes on about the concept of relevance. Now, I don't want to get sidetracked with that, but what's interesting is that Roger was very, very much interested in information retrieval in the early days. It was only later that he kind of moved to these other areas for which he became rightly famous. So this is an example of his input to the, now I suspect that this was probably a report that was commissioned by the SRC about the state of computer science in the UK and what they were going to fund or something like that. And so I've only got the letter by Roger. And if anybody knows what the original report is, then I'd love to know about it, and I'd like to read it actually. So he highlighted, right at the end, he highlighted this concept of relevance. Now, that concept of relevance became extremely important in information retrieval, and having said that, I'm going to spend almost no time on it. The literature is littered with discussions about relevance. I mean, if you do a search on your favorite search engine, relevance in some context like IR, you get 1 million hits or something like that. I mean, it's quite ridiculous. And there were books being written on it, and there have been, you know. And basically, what we've ended up with is that in a retrieval system, you're looking for documents that are relevant or items that are relevant to an information or a user's need. And this is a description of, I mean, it's almost vacuous actually, but it's an accurate description, because what it says is that you're looking for something, and when you find it, right, you will recognize it, and it will affect your state of mind. And then when you keep on looking, you are kind of looking for more information from a different point of view. So this is a sort of modern version of the concept of relevance. And this was an example taken from a thesis by somebody called Pierre Berland in 2000. And so when I got into the field in 69, I spent some time trying to distinguish, and that's what Roger did, information retrieval from database retrieval. And so you can sort of tabulate it, the differences. And I won't go through every single item, but the left-hand column, the extreme left, is, if you like, the concept that we're talking about, like matching. And then the next column is what you might expect matching to be like if you're in databases. And on the right, you would expect to be in information retrieval. Now, having said that, what happened, and if I can do a kind of a pictorial account of it, what happened in the relationship between databases and information retrieval, in the 60s and the 70s, databases and information retrieval sort of drifted apart. So the column, the left-hand column, the exact match column, got further away from the right-hand column, and that we saw them as two different disciplines. And in fact, from a funding point of view, it became quite important to be able to have that difference, because if you went to a funding council or the EU and said, look, I want to fund a project to do with information retrieval, and they are likely to turn around and say, but it's only a subset of databases. Why are you asking under the umbrella information retrieval? So there was quite a fight to try and keep those two separate. Now in the last 10 years, on the other hand, these things have come together again. And in fact, people working and publishing in the database area, often, when I look at their papers, could easily have published their material in an information retrieval journal or proceedings. So, you have a view of, for example, matching as being in databases that it would be exact matching. In other words, it either matches or it doesn't. And if it doesn't match, you don't retrieve it. If there's an exact match, you retrieve it. In information retrieval, you talk about partial match, and it means that things can match approximately. You usually have a way of measuring the extent of which the approximation occurs. What's another good example? The logics, which I'll say a bit about later on, they usually use classical logic in databases and non-classical logic in information retrieval. Query language, this is the one that I'm looking for. That's the more important one, actually. So, in databases, the query languages are typically something like SQL, right? I'm not saying it's always SQL, but it's something like that. So it's very, very precisely formulated. In information retrieval, it tends to be on the natural language side, but you process it in some way, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. But the point is that it's not as strict as in databases. So there is this difference, and the difference goes all the way down these columns. Now you can, this diagram is reproduced many, many times now. It's been in the literature for over 20, 30 years, and people have discussed it at length. So if you ever wanted to find out more, you could look in the literature. Right. back to Robert Fairthorne. I'm jumping around a little bit because it's quite difficult to kind of get the timeline sorted out. I wanted, so this is part of the sort of one of the sub-themes I have about the supporting of work, intellectual work in the UK, right, and so on. Now, Fairthorne was a brilliant man, in my opinion, and what I particularly wanted to say to you is to read the last 2 or 3 sentences of the first paragraph. So he did a lot of original things. He worked on lots of mechanical devices for doing retrieval, and then obviously wrote a lot of intellectual things. But then he says, because he worked at the Royal RAE, that's the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, yeah? That's where he worked. And then he says, so this letter is to me, CVR's me. He says, but I'm tempted to sum matters up by never be a pioneer of anything anywhere, but especially not in England and in the British civil service. Now, I thought this might hit a nerve. Well, I mean, I have a report that he sent me, yeah, which it's an extraordinary piece of work actually in many ways when it was produced, and I'm not quite sure of the details here. The British civil service sat on it for about 4 years. That's what he's complaining about, and it's
it wasn't 40.
Well, it's a very, very sad story. This, I mean, given the brilliance of the man, it really is. And he was a wonderful man, actually. That's the other thing. I met him eventually, and thought he was such a nice guy. But then he had to be treated like this. Anyway, there we go. So, back to the story in the UK. This is an example of, there were some people who were quite, if you like, I don't know, they were switched on. They were in touch with what was going on in the information retrieval field, on the sort of semi-commercial operational side. And so the Ministry of Technology, yes, the Ministry of Technology commissioned a report, so this is in the 1970s, on the information retrieval systems in the United States. So they sent over a body of people, and I have a copy of the report actually, and it's amazing how detailed it is. They visited a huge number of sites, and they met some of the people. For example, the one that I class as one of the top pioneers in the subject, Bill Marin, M.E. Marin, he worked then at Rand Corporation, met him, and several other people. This is a thread which I'll come back to in a minute. They also having visited Rand, not only did they meet Bill Marin, they met a person called Martin Kay. Now, I'm just going to talk a little bit ahead, because the development of IR in the UK, right, derives a lot from the development of things in what was called the Cambridge Language Research Unit. Now, in the Cambridge Language Research Unit, this is a unit that was kind of active in the 50s, you know, were people like Martin Kay, who now was he's ended up at Rand, Sparck Jones, Roger Needham, Yorick Wilkes, people like that. These are all people, they're still, well, Karen and Roger not around anymore, but people who've still been around, were around for a long time, right, active in the field, had come out of this unit, which was being run by somebody you probably never heard of, Margaret Masterman. But she was the director of the unit, and it orchestrated a lot of work which was foundational from the point of view of information retrieval. Anyway, so these people from the ministry, who did this report, made contact with some of these people who subsequently moved on and wrote this report. And that's it. They wrote a report. It was excellent, right? And I don't know if anything came out of it actually. It was just a very useful report. So now I'm going to connect a little bit more specific IR and IR research and so on, right? And also naming some people on the way. So So that's a kind of, for me, that's a sort of a semi-political, semi-background for information retrieval. So the word information retrieval was coined by somebody called Calvin Moores. You can check that in the OED actually. It's actually cited in the OED he did it in 1950, so he was quite a big shot. Many people mark the International Conference on Scientific Information, which was held in Washington in 1958, as the beginning of the field. Yeah? Now, I went through the proceedings. It's a huge document. I mean, it's 1,600 pages. And believe it or not, this is quite funny actually, it's on the web. You can download it. I mean, I downloaded 70 megabytes, I downloaded it on my iPad, and brilliant. I mean, this is a bit of information retrieval which is kind of just taken for granted now, but I have this 1,600 page document and I can look at it at will and so on. It's brilliant. Anyway, it's a huge document, and many people in the field recognize it as sort of the starting point of the discipline, of the field. Now, if you go through the attendance list, right, then the people that I know, who I think are sort of big shots in the field, or were big shots in the field, were all at this conference, right? More importantly, from a sort of very parochial point of view, is that many of the people from the Cambridge Language Research Unit were there. So Karen was there, Roger was there, right? People who were associated with them, it was quite extraordinary. So there was a bringing together of people who, if you like, were suddenly discovering themselves as being in a particular field. And so this is often marked as the beginning of the subject. So after that, in terms of conferences, there was a series of conferences, and I can't date these precisely. I mean, they went on, they were run in the 60s, and I'm not entirely sure when they petered out. But there were the Cranfield conferences as we knew them, and they were conferences about information retrieval. It was a series of conferences about information, and they were in the UK, right? They were at a place called Cranfield, and they were organised by a man called Cyril Cleverdon, and I'll come to Cyril in a minute. He's one of the sort of pioneering figures. And they were extremely influential, extremely so. And in fact, the methodology for doing information retrieval to this day still goes back to the methodology that was defined at Cranfield by Cyril Cleverdon and his co-workers, right? And obviously was exposed over and over again, that methodology, in the Cranfield conference. I attended one or two, but it was in the early 70s. I can't remember exactly. There he is. Now, Cyril is one of the top, right? And the field, and this is a sign that the field has moved on a bit. The field has its field medal, right? It's called the Salton Award. It's the ACM CIR Salton Award. Yes, that's right. The first person to get it, this is quite a bit odd actually, because it probably should have been Cyril, because he predates both Sparck Jones and Salton in terms of his work, right? But you know what it's like. These people are kind of, they're part of the background, and then people wake up later and think, oh yes, that person was really quite influential in this field, and we should recognise him. So the first person, I'll come back a little bit to Salton, was Jerry Salton. It wasn't called the Salton Award when Salton was awarded. You understand, right? It was called something else. And I have to make a confession. It was called had no name attached to it, and then the community decided to rename it. And being sort of dinosaur that I am, I sort of objected. I said, why do we have to rename it? You know. Anyway, it was done, and now it's a Salton Award. Then Karen got it, Sparck Jones, and then Cyril got it. Now Cyril, arguably in terms of, as I said, in terms of the experimental methodology to do with testing information retrieval systems, right, was probably the most influential person in the field, and he continues to be influential. Okay, I'll come back to that in a minute. So just to finish the story, now that I've sort of pointed at Karen, this is the early chronology of IR. Now, I have to confess, I don't know whether there was a development in parallel to this anywhere else. I mean, there were some developments which came a bit later and overlapped, but I don't know. But this is a development I'm aware of. And what's remarkable is that the person who supervised Roger Needham was actually David Wheeler. Now, you all know about David because he worked with Maurice Wilkes and, you know, the EDSAC, etc., etc., etc. What people don't know, and I mean, I know this, remember it very well, because when I was doing my research in information retrieval, if I had a sticky theoretical problem in IR, who would I go and talk to? David Wheeler, right? And he knew all this stuff, right? He was really well versed in the topic. He was the supervisor of Roger's work. Roger did his work, it was on classification and grouping, which actually the same as my thesis, I worked on that too. And David was the supervisor. And the Cambridge Language Research Unit was important because the problem that Roger worked on really derived from the work that was ongoing in the Cambridge Language Research Unit. That's the connection there on his thesis work. And then there was a follow-on thesis which everybody seems to have forgotten about. I think there were some personal difficulties there, but anyway, was a thesis by David Jackson, who also did a thesis on classification in 1969, which incidentally is when I came into the picture. I started to do my work, and concurrently with that is the work by Sparck Jones, who worked on syntax, synonymy, and semantics, natural language semantics anyway. But it was not immediately in that development of IR. In a sense, the way I view it is that the information retrieval that Karen did subsequently, she sort of took over from Roger. Roger sort of gradually bowed out, and Karen Sparck Jones sort of bowed in. And then, as I said, I came in at the tail end of that. So let's talk a little bit about the information retrieval. And I deliberately just summarise this because I don't know to what extent it's going to be sensible to spend much time on this. So the way I could summarise the development of the various models, now this is more intellectual. It's based on geometry, natural language, probability, statistics. But the way I would summarise that, to start with, that much of modern information retrieval, as people do it now, including the systems that underlie Google or Bing, are based on counting. Now, this may sound strange to you, but if you're a mathematician, which I'm not, but I mean I've done a lot of mathematics, a lot of mathematics is based on counting. That's where you start, with the numbers, right? And so, when people were faced with the problem of representing text in some way in the information retrieval community, what they said was that we ought to be able to get hold of the meaning, the semantics of things from the point of view retrieval by simply counting words, tokens, stems, you name it, but basically getting distributional information about the pieces of text that you're handling. Right, so what became important was term frequency analysis of documents. So I'll just show this slide actually because I don't want to dwell on it. Oh, I seem to have pushed it all the way down the bottom. Okay, I won't do that. So the TF stands for term frequency. And a man called Lund in the States is pretty much credited with first drawing attention to the significance of using term frequency counts to represent documents from the point of view of getting retrieval done. And then another statistic, if I can call it that, called IDF, which is inverse document frequency count. That's the counting of words across documents, and basically saying that we have a measure called IDF, which is rarer a term or a word is in a collection of documents, the more important it is. And you quantify that. Now, this sounds incredibly trivial, right? However, all the theory that has come subsequently, which is probabilistic, language modeling, using Bayes' theorem, you name it, right? All this theoretical stuff really, in the end, goes back to being able to count these items and being able to say, okay, we can count them, we can draw, if you like, or represent them in distributional form, and we can make inferences about this information, which statistic comes in, and if you want to make other kinds of inferences, Bayes' theorem. Incidentally, I went to the Turing exhibit earlier on, just before coming here. Turing, together with Jack Good, invented a sort of a scheme for decoding stuff, right, on the bonds. And it was based actually on Bayes' theorem. Actually, the version that he used, which I'd read the Jack Good paper on it, the version that he used is almost the same version that's used in information retrieval, the probabilistic models from information retrieval. Very close, right? It's just a very sensible application of Bayes' theorem. So these are landmarks, these are sort of things that stand out. I won't belabor the architecture point. Relevance feedback, I'll repeat this later on again a little bit. The reason I highlight this now is because in the last 20 or 30 years, right, the idea that given that your queries are only inexact and that you're actually interested in the approximate matching, and that what you end up doing is that you get if you like, a measure, a ranking in terms of how certain you are whether the thing's going to be relevant or not. A lot of the systems, the experimental systems in particular, depend on being able to use feedback on the items that have been output so far. So you get some feedback information and you then re-rank on the basis of that feedback. In fact, it predates a lot of the machine learning work, right? So one of the earliest probabilistic models used in IR, right, is simply a one-level perceptron, right, which is a machine learning technique. It was being used years before it was popularized in machine learning. And so I think I'll move on because I'm starting to feel I'm going to run time. I think I am. Yes. What time did I start, by the way? Right, so I've still got roughly another half hour, is that right? I'm not used to giving, huh? I know, but I'm not used to giving long lectures, I'm used to giving short lectures. So I've got a few things to say about the development of the subject as we know it today. Let me just scan on so I can see where I'm heading. Yeah, okay. Right, this is another one of my BCS remarks. Remember I said that the BCS published the first, published in its first journal, a paper on information retrieval by Fairthorne. So the most important conference in information retrieval to date is the CIGAR ACM conference. And it also, that organization, the ACM CIGAR, awards the Sultan Award, the field medal, if you like. However, in the very early days, there was actually a joint conference, and it was called the BCS ACM conference. Right? And this is an example of the very first joint BCS ACM. So what happened was that in America, they put together a conference, and in the UK, we did the same. We put together something, I think we might have called it the IRSG colloquium or something like that, which was developing into a conference. So at some point we said, okay, let's get together and let's have one conference. So we had the joint BCS ACM conference, and it ran this year, the first year, 1980, and then it ran again. And then guess what? Very suddenly and gradually, no, suddenly, not gradually, the BCS was just dropped from the conference, and it became the ACM conference. So, I mean, my view of it is that it got hijacked. I mean, a lot of people will disagree with me, no doubt, but it's important to mark the occasion, actually, because I was involved in setting up the joint conference, and I got a lot of flack for being intransigent about it, and of course, I now feel kind of sad about it, because as soon as I let go, if you like, the ACM just took it over. And it now is the CIGAR ACM or ACM CIGAR conference. However, let me emphasize the point. The IRSG, which is the British Information Retrieval Specialist Group, was involved right from the beginning in setting up this thing. So, just whizzing you through the sort of the timeline of things that happened, just to give you a little bit more of a revision, right? So you had Moores coining the term information retrieval. Then you had in 1958, you had this basic conference, which I think was the conference that everybody considered was the beginning of the field. Then after that, you had the Cranfield conferences and Cranfield projects, actually, so I've got them Cranfield 1 and so on. Then you get this man, Bill Marin, who are considered to be a pioneer of the subject. He wrote a very, very influential paper. And then 1963, this is one of the major events in the States in terms of IR, is the development of an experimental system called SMART. Never mind what the acronym stands for. There are all sorts of cute sort of versions of the acronym, but it was basically an experimental IR system. It was developed by a man called Jerry Saltman, the one who got the award the first time. He was based at Harvard to begin with and ended up at Cranfield, at Cornell. Then you had several other sort of important conferences, and then another major event was the publications of Jerry Saltman's book, which was pretty much a landmark, actually. To this date, I think people still consider it important, and so on. Let me move on. This is like a laundry list. Here we are, there's the BCS conferences. So you had the first ACM CIR conference in 1978, and then you had the first BCS IR conference in 1979. Then you got the joint conference, and then, as I said, you had another one, and then it became a single conference just based on the ACM, and so on. So, is there anything else that I ought to highlight there? Yes, I should, because I'm going to talk about this next. So right at the bottom there, where you see Trek. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about, as I said I would, about the experimental methodology that evolved over time, but it goes back to the early work of Cyril Cleverdon at Cranfield. I'm going to talk about that in a minute now. That work went on and established itself and so on, right? And it culminated in 1992, I think it is, yes. It culminated in a series of conferences that are still ongoing called TREC. And they are text retrieval something conference. I think I have the acronym expanded later on. And the conferences are run every year. They're kind of competitive conferences, and people participate in them, and then they bring novel software or novel experimental techniques to the conference, and then they run them, if you like, against the work from other people. So there's a kind of a competition, right? Although they're not allowed to call it a competition. You understand? Academics don't do that. Right. Anyway, that's the target. But in the meantime, there was Cleverdon and his work at Cranfield. Now, Cyril Cleverdon had a series of projects at Cranfield, right? Which one was called Cranfield 1, and there was another one called Cranfield 2. And in those projects, right, he pretty much laid down, right, the sort of experimental methodology for doing information retrieval. They were extremely well designed, comparing techniques of indexing, comparing manual against automatic techniques, you name it. Those are the sort of things that he was doing. on test collections of documents, and then trying to, if you like, in a statistical manner, to see which strategy or which process was better than another one. And the way the results of these experiments were measured were through two parameters. One's called precision, which is basically measuring. It's a numerical way of measuring what, how good is it what you're getting, right? So are you getting mostly good stuff and a little bit of bad stuff when you retrieve? And recall, which is a parameter measuring, are you getting all of it, or are you getting half of it, or are you getting a proportion of it? And those two things, they trade off, and it's pretty difficult to escape the trade-off, actually. The trade-off being that as you try and push up the precision in your experimentation, the recall typically goes down, and vice versa. So this is a kind of an experimental law, and it really was sort of discussed and made apparent by Cyril Cleverdon. And in his honour, actually, the technique is called to this day, it's still called the Cranfield paradigm. So you have a document collection, you have some relevant judgment. This means that you, for a set of questions, retrieval requests, you know which documents in the collection should be retrieved and which should not be retrieved. You then run strategy A and strategy B against the collection. You evaluate the performance of both strategies in terms of the precision and recall. You then compare A and B statistically, right? Meaning, for example, using a statistical significance test, and then you state whether A is the same as B, A is better than B, or the other way around. That is basically what people have accepted as the Cranfield paradigm. It's still being used in this series of consciousness track, and it all goes back to the early work of Cyril Cleverdon. So we ended up with TREC, right, in the early 90s. It's the Text Retrieval Conference. Now, a little bit of history here, in the sense of very specific history. So in 1975, Sparck Jones and I actually proposed the creation, this is proposing to, funding bodies, the creation of a very, very large test collection. One of the problems with the experimentation in information retrieval was that the test data was very small, tiny in fact, and so Sultan, who's very, very well known, did all his experimentation on very, very small collections. So we sat down and said, okay, let's see if we can design an ideal test collection. This is 1975. And ideal being, that it's big enough so that you have a reasonable chance, if you do the experimentation, that the results you get, you can prove to be statistically significant. That sort of argumentation. And it was an extensive piece of work, actually. And the project was funded by the British Library Research and Development, as it says there, blurred, which is, I think, I'm not entirely sure actually, but I think it's a transformation of an earlier organisation called OSTI, Office of Scientific and Technical Information. And so we delivered this report and we said, okay, this is what you need. If we're going to make any more headway with information retrieval, we've got to get beyond this business of people who are going to say, well, this is all very fine, but the collections are much too small, so go away. Come back when you've done the work on a proper size collection. Well, the report was lovely, and it got attention and so on, and then nothing happened. I actually tried to persuade the German funding bodies to fund it, and I also tried to persuade the French bodies to fund it. In the end, nothing was funded in the UK. And then, in 1991, it was picked up, the ideas and the work actually, it was picked up in the States, and they started with funding from NIST. They started a series, there was a little bit of earlier work, they started a series of conferences called the TREC. And TREC is still running to this date, and it's using huge collections. And there's an enormous effort goes into doing these experiments. It's extremely successful. So there's another kind of, a missed opportunity, which, I don't know. I mean, I suppose I would already say, well, it was interesting doing it, but it would have been nice if we also ended up building it. Anyway, that's the story of how TREC came about. This is measuring performance, so I'm not going to do this now because I'm not going to have time, but basically this is an example of how you come up with these two parameters mathematically. Right? So you can probably, if you're at all familiar with this kind of notation, it's basically a contingency table. You split the sets two ways, and then you produce these ratios, and then the bits where I talk about PRP and single number measures are the bits that are important from a theoretical point of view. So one of the important principles that was developed in the subject quite some time ago was called the probability ranking principle. And basically it said, and it was a kind of a Bayesian argument actually, it was based on a bit of Bayesian probability theory. It says that there are ways of retrieving documents if you do them in order of their probability of relevance in a particular way. That is the best possible way of doing it, an optimization principle. And the reason you could make the argument mathematically is because of the form of the evaluation measures. Now, precision and recall, although they're there as ratios, can be restated as probabilities. You can actually just reformulate them. And then in terms of those probabilities, you can show that if you retrieve documents in a retrieval setup, in the probability of relevance, right, then in terms of those parameters, precision and recall, formulated probabilistically, then that is the best you can do, right? And you can change the argument slightly, and basically it's a Bayesian argument, and what you're doing is you're sort of minimizing the Bayesian error. Right? It's a very strong principle, and it's used all the time now, and so it evolved out of the work on evaluation and probabilistic retrieval. I'll skip that. Go on that. Just want to talk about. Go back. Right. I want to talk a little bit about representation, and then I'm getting to the end of my tether. The talk. Right. A glass of water, actually. My throat's stuck. Is that possible to get that in, water?
Yes.
I mean, anything else that's liquid would be fine. Sorry. So on the previous slide, you may have noticed that there was this layer of representation in the middle there. So a big thing in information retrieval is how you represent things. Right? When the textual objects and when the objects you're retrieving are text, pieces of text, documents, and when the queries are text. And the representation layer, right, is extremely important. And then this is, if you like, a paradigm for information retrieval. You have the things you want to retrieve from and the queries, they interact, you match, you get an approximate match. You probably do a ranking, actually, as I said, using the probability ranking principle. And then you go around again because you have some feedback, right? So the representation layer is rather important. Now, the business about the counting, right? So I'm going to move on to slightly more sophisticated stuff, is that a man called Lund in the 50s proposed that you really ought to look at the way words are distributed in text, and not all words are equal. It depends on their frequency of distribution, and you can actually dress that up in probability theory. So he had this idea that it was the middle range frequencies that were important for currents. So the higher currents terms were useless from the point of view of retrieval. Very rare words, this is within one document, right, were useless, and it was the middle ones who were important. And some were right in the middle is probably the best, and then they gradually shade away. So this is his idea. This is a good statement of it, actually. This he made in 1958. This is quite a good verbal statement. So what he was trying to do, he was trying to build. So he wasn't doing retrieval initially, trying to build abstracts of documents automatically. So what he did was he had a document, a large document, and then he went through and tried to decide the significance of, oh great, sorry, thank you. The significance of individual sentences. And so these factors of significance told them which sentences to extract and which sentences to suppress. And then the important sentences ended up being making up the abstract. And it worked very well. Anyway, that was the basis of his use of discounting information. That's Needham. So, and this brings me back to, again, to another trend in IR, which is the use of natural language processing and natural language. And the Cambridge Language Research Unit was positioned in this area in the 50s and tried to use very sophisticated natural language techniques. So, you know, I think Chomsky was already making an impression then, and there were people working in AI which had very fancy ideas about how you would use syntax and semantics automatically and so on. Problem is, and this was a problem, is that none of that natural language stuff worked. It just didn't, right? I've done it myself. You would design. I mean, I've tried. I mean, some of you maybe know a bit more about linguistics, probably more than I do. But anyway, I tried using Montague semantics to code up, the semantics of documents, and basically, it's almost impossible to get it to work. So at the same time, there were these people who, and to a certain extent, the Cambridge Language Research Unit was part of that in some way. There's people working with very sophisticated linguistic notions, trying to build into IR systems. And then parallel to that were the people who had, and Karen became part of that community actually, the second community, who had very simple ideas about how you would actually represent textual objects. You basically based it on counting. So you had term frequency counts, and then you had another count which is called IDF, which is called inverse document frequency, which I said is, if you like, the rarer the term, the more important it is. And you did very simple things to the words. You basically suffix stripped them and then produced the stems of the words, right? So you took all the sophisticated linguistic stuff, right, and mapped it onto a very simple object, basically consisted of counting of terms. And blow me, that proved to be very effective in IR. So the linguistic work was pushed into the background, and the theory for IR took off on the basis of this counting information, and people produced, to this day, still produce these fairly sophisticated models. Nowadays, by nowadays I mean the last 2 or 3 years, the natural language work has come back, and what's happened is that they're combining what you might call the compositional approach to semantics with the counting approach, the distributional stuff, trying to put them together, right, and getting a model which is now called compositional distributional for text. It's a very interesting story, that. So there are several models that were developed over time. I have a list of them here, but I don't need the list. Oops. The basic model, and this gives me a little chance to say something about the operational systems. The basic model is based on Boolean logic. And you all know Boolean logic, A and B or C and so on, right? And that means that the object either satisfies the Boolean request or it doesn't. So you get what most people can say, you either get nothing or you get everything. And I'm sure you've had this experience online. Roger Needham actually started with Boolean lattices, Boolean logic, and then progressed to non-Boolean ones, as indeed was proposed by Moores and Fairthorne. Right? They already saw in the 50s and 60s that you really have to go beyond Boolean logic. Sultan, the other pioneer who got the Sultan Award, the first person to get the Sultan Award, he pioneered the use of, and some people say he and his student may have even invented it, a sort of a geometric model, which is called the vector space model, which is basically that once you've taken your text, if you have a million documents, you transform every document into a very simple representation, which you can represent as a vector. And you have lots of vectors in a vector space, and you can do all your retrieving, all your machinations inside that space, called a vector space. So that was vector space model. The probabilistic one. Now I think, see, this is the, if you like, to date, if you were to say to somebody, well, which of the retrieval models is the one that's, if you like, lasted and is actually, of great interest still, right? They probably would tell you it's a probabilistic model. Now, that started sort of with Marin, right? Although he never really spelt it out completely. But then, and this is partly why I put this up actually, because again, this is something that not many people know, is that in 1970, Bill Miller did a thesis on information retrieval at Newcastle, and he was supervised by Elizabeth Barraclough. And in that is the first serious formulation of a probabilistic retrieval model. Remember what I said, you have this probability ranking principle, and the probability ranking principle is that you try and retrieve documents in their probability of relevance, and then you have this is an optimization process. And that's easy to say, difficult to do, right? You have to get the probabilities, you have to quantify the probability, and you have to make it work. Well, the work started with Miller, it was then picked up by Karen and Sparck Jones, Stephen Robinson and myself, right, and produced various versions of it. The one that probably is the most used one is the one based on the publication by Karen Sparck Jones and Stephen Robinson. That work transformed into the current model called language modeling, which is, if you like, the sexiest model around at the moment. If you want to read about the history of that probabilistic model, and it makes quite interesting reading, the paper that I've cited at the bottom, which paper I wrote in 2005. And then the logical one. Right, now the logic, I say logical and not Boolean, is because people have indeed gone on beyond Boole, and they have actually said, right, the logical model is basically, a document implies a query or it doesn't. If it implies a query, you retrieve it. If it doesn't imply a query, you don't retrieve it. But of course, you can then ask the question, is there a way of talking about that implication as a plausible inference, where you attach it and measure uncertainty to the inference? And indeed, models like that have been built. So those are the kind of theoretical developments that happened over time. Right, mopping up. So, I'm coming to the end of the talk, really. I know it's a bit of a hodgepodge, but that's the only way I could do it. I've said very little about HCI. I've also stopped short of web retrieval. Now, you could ask and say, well, what about web retrieval? What about Google and Bing? I mean, I know the underlying engine for Google. The basic engine, which is a sort of a popularity engine, is based on a eigenvector routine, right? And it's it's sort of complicated, but in some senses it's not. That is really only the start of the process. So in other words, if you talk to people from Google and say to them, well, for example, they've stopped development on that particular aspect of the retrieval engine, right? They've just frozen it, right? There are lots of other techniques that they've brought into it. So web retrieval is actually taking on board quite a lot of the research that was produced in the last 20 or 30 years, and it's being incorporated in these engines. Operational systems. Well, what's to say about operational systems? Well, there were, in the early days, lots of online or batch processing systems. One of the systems that I want to highlight, actually, because it did quite a lot of interesting research as well. There was a system called UCIS, the UK Chemical Information Service. It was based on chemical abstracts. and they were based in Sheffield, I think it was. And they were very generous with their data, and they actually produced some interesting research. I think a lot of their work was based on the work of Perry and Kent. So there were organisations which were sort of operational and did research. There were also systems like Dialogue, Blaze, and so on. There were lots of operational IO systems which I always thought were pretty clunky, but they made money, and so they went on for a long time. And well, you know now that they're sort of faded. And then this is a statement from the Financial Times. It brings you right up to date, January 2013. And what's interesting about that is the very last couple of sentences. You may have read the editorial about storing information in DNA. Yeah? And then the editor says, well, don't worry, because the retrieval problem is basically unsolved, which is the indexing problem. So it's, I mean, the thing that's amazing, actually, I mean, I fairly regularly read the Financial Times. The amount of business information about retrieval type systems, not strict retrieval, but that comes into the Financial Times. It's quite extraordinary, actually. From 50 or 40 years ago, people saying, well, what is information retrieval? And it's quite different now. Anyway, that's January 28. And this is, if you look at that carefully, you'll see that that's. You got to follow the wires. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Keith. Are there any questions or comments?
Is that Mr. Go?
Well, I guess I've got to admit how I found that. I put in a query to Google and said, find me something, I can't remember what the query was actually, and in images, right? And I wasn't looking for anything like this at all. And there were lots of images, and I scanned down and scanned down and scanned down. None of it was relevant. And then I saw this cartoon, and I thought, oh, that's very nice.
If I understand, I'm sitting in the middle of a small group which might have been heckling you all afternoon. But
You didn't?
We didn't.
Why not?
We wanted to hear what you had to say.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you.
We've all been working in this field, effectively, for 40 years or more, and entirely below the academic radar.
That might not be the case based on my talk, because I don't know if you were at the beginning, but I cut a huge amount of stuff out. So which aspect am I missing?
Well, for example, to talk about police systems, which are some of the ones we can talk about.
Police systems?
Yes. They've been using combinations of formatted data,
Yep.
database stuff,
Sure.
and text
Yep.
in combination.
Sure. Which system are you using? Oracle?
No, individual. As I said, it's maybe.
No, I mean, I know about systems that try and combine texts because I tried to use them myself about 20, 30 years ago.
The point I wanted to make really is that in the commercial field, things go on and solutions are developed entirely without any awareness of what's going on in the academic world. So we haven't heard anything previously of the whole of your talk. It's all completely new to me.
Well, that's brilliant. You got your money's worth. Well, I mean, I can actually, I can probably display my credentials about the contact I've had with commercial systems and the extent to which I've been involved in building them, but that's not going to persuade you.
May I say one other thing about the civil service?
Oh, no.
We presented a software system which we thought was relevant to a problem we'd heard of from a particular department of the civil service. I won't identify it. I'm not sure I can remember who it was.
Yeah.
And at the end of the session, the senior gentleman on the other side of the desk said, "That is a very good system. It might be relevant to us. But you should realise that it's only 18 months before I retire, and I'm not going to allow any major changes in my department until
Well, can I give you some examples of commercial interaction? So, do you remember view data in Prestel, right? Stephen Robson and I wrote a very, very detailed report and presented. Who owned view data or Prestel in those days? Was it Post Office? Presented to them great detailed account of the kind of system, right, which would probably have been something like a Google type system with visualization, for view data. They gave it to them and said, look, this is based on 20, 30 years of work, right? The crappy system you're implementing on the television, right, just isn't, it's not good enough, right? He said it very politely. And it just sank.
Yeah.
And I can give you lots of examples of other types of. So it may be that the commercial work, although I don't believe that actually, is below the academic radar. When us academics try and actually parcel up the work from the academic world and say, look, here it is, right? I mean, we're available. It usually just sinks. And the reason is, and it's a good example, and I understand it, right? I don't feel negative about it at all. The reason is simply that if you look at the commercial online systems that were around, and you went and talked to them, which I did, and I said, look, we can prove that the retrieval performance you would get if you use one of these techniques would be better than, say, built-in retrieval. And they would say, yes, I'm sure you can prove that. However, we are making money out of the system as it is, right? And that's what matters. So go away, basically. And that's been an experience. Sorry, David, go ahead.
Can I make what is probably a slightly trivial remark, but it's still important to any Cambridge person. You had the slide with David Wheeler going to Roger Needham down there. What the David Wheeler supervised Roger. That's the slide you had. It just proves the point that all ideas in computing came from David Wheeler.
Well, I would support that. I'm another great admirer of David Wheeler.
Also, what you didn't have on the slide, of course, was under Roger Needham, there was a small arrow there to blow the student who actually did some of the programming for you.
Yes.
That is theory.
Yeah, no, that's clear in some of the documentations I've seen, actually.
I had no idea what it was.
Yeah, no. Actually, that work was quite sophisticated mathematically.
Was it?
Oh, yeah, right. Well, I mean, his thesis is basically mathematics.
Yeah.
So,
But he had an extraordinary career.
yeah, he certainly did. And you've woken up.
Naughty. Whenever I wake up, I always say, here, you
I did, yes, I have noticed.
Fascinating, but, and then what that gentleman was saying is quite right, because we were banging around with the Financial Times in 1961, setting up a library system, and we had seen no idea that anybody in the academic world was doing anything about it. But that probably
But the Financial Times did know, because I had a project with the Financial Times for 2 years.
At what date?
Much later, we've been in the 80s, I think. No, late 80s or early 90s. So one of the things so when did the Mosaic come on stream? The web browser. The very earliest web browser. Right, okay, so I had two students, right, who were designing web browsers before the web browsers actually came on stream commercially. Right. And I actually went to the Financial Times and said to them, this is the future, right? And it was an interesting story in itself, actually, because the guy, the chief executive officer, said to me, he said, I hear what you say, it's very interesting. He said, you've got 15 minutes to persuade my board, right, that we want to do this, that what you're proposing, right, as a piece of development.
Yeah.
So I had 15 minutes and talked to the board, and he said, yeah, do it. And this is what's interesting, actually, from my point of view, because you do it with the funding council, it takes 3 months before you get your money. The next day, I had a check in the post to pay these two guys to continue working. And that was working with the Financial Times.
The FT did quite a lot of
Yeah.
these sorts of stuff. Changing the subject for a minute, fascinating looking at the information that you've been talking about this afternoon of, if you like, machine information. And comparing that with neural information or cognitive neuroscience.
Yeah, that's just done. People do work with neural systems for information retrieval.
Oh yes, but I was thinking of how information is represented in the brain.
Oh,
Which is,
no idea.
well, nobody does. that makes a few million of it. But particularly, you touched on the subject.
Oh yeah, you mentioned this to me before, a few minutes ago, yeah. Right.
Relevance
Yeah,
and significance and the word meaning.
yeah.
And we've been trying to look in to see if anybody anywhere has come up with a definition of meaning. What does information?
What is the meaning of meaning?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, there is actually a paper by an English scholar that has exactly that title, The Meaning of Meaning. But I read it, but it didn't give me.
because that seems to us even more important
Sure.
than actually understanding how neurons do things.
No, absolutely. But I wager that nobody is able to quantify. What linguists do is they say, we will give you a formal semantics for a statement in language, a sentence, right? And if you then follow that path, they do indeed give you a statement of what it is, but right at the bottom, right, are atomic items, right, which are then assumed, if you like, to be atomic, right, and somehow their meaning, right, you're going to have to get from a dictionary, right, and then you put all this together and you have the meaning of the sentence. You're always in this loop, aren't you? Because if you might go down as far as you can go to the atomic statements, and the atomic statements you can only give a meaning to by making yet statements in English language, which is of course what you're trying to represent formally. So
This one.
I can't do it.
Just like to thank you for filling in a bit more of the Fairthorne family history.
You know of him, do you?
Well, I worked at I worked at Kinetic and Derra.
Yeah.
So I met the name, but Fairthorne was no longer head of RE Maths Department or whatever it was by the time I got there. But I'd seen the name previously in is it the thesis of Mary Croaken? Martin Campbell-Kelly may know.
Yeah. Well, that's right. I actually discussed that briefly with Martin early on.
Okay. And one of my jobs in this group is to look after an Elliott 903 computer up at Bletchley. And the son, whose Christian name I forget, his wife Belinda, he wrote the guidebook to the Elliott 903 for beginners. So I met these people at a birthday party and retrospectively put two and two together that he was the son of the Fairthorne. It was quite a bizarre coincidence.
Did you know that he did these wonderful cartoons?
No, I didn't.
Well, when he used to go, this is in the 90s, when he used to go to seminars, he used to sit there, right, and draw a cartoon of the speaker in some form. Right. I mean, I gave a seminar with him in the audience, and he sent me the cartoon. And basically, their cartoons were almost like a frog, right? And the frog gets up to something. In my case, I was talking about the relationship between theory, experiment, and practice in information retrieval. So he had this frog, right, balancing these balls, each one labelled experiment, practice, and so on. So yeah, he did a lot of these cartoons actually. The special issue on Fairthorne, in the general documentation, is really worth reading.
I think that.
I remember him as being slightly eccentric.
Yes, he was eccentric. Yeah, I know. You do. How did
When he
you?
came to the lab seminars,
How did you recognise that?
It takes one to get. Yes.
there's no answer.
Well, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating talk and all the
Pleasure being
threads that we took on with the comments and discussions. So thank you very much. I'd like just to remind you about our next meeting on the 21st of March, in a month's time, exactly 4 weeks, and it will be about Atlas.